So welcome, and please take the floor. I hope your PowerPoints are there. They're coming. And welcome.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Whilst they put the PowerPoint presentation up, I just want to, first of all, say on behalf of Jim Willis, the joint head of the Basel, Stockholm, and Rotterdam Convention, we want to thank you for this opportunity to interact with you and to give you some details on how the Rotterdam Convention functions. There are many versions from many different people on what the convention is for, what it does, and how it functions. It is open for interpretation by parties, but as the Secretariat, I can let you know what legally the document says. I want to highlight that there are many hazardous, toxic, and dangerous chemicals in use and trade today. That's not going to change. What we want to do is to ensure that all of the benefits that you gain from those chemicals are received by countries, and you minimize or eliminate, if possible, the risks associated with them. It's finding the best way to handle and use them within the setting of your own country. What is possible in Italy is not necessarily possible in Kyrgyzstan. And what's possible in Kyrgyzstan is not necessarily possible in Costa Rica. It has to apply to the country where you are. An example of this is a chemical that's managed by the Stockholm Convention, which, by the way, does ban the use of chemicals. In the Stockholm Convention, they mandate the ban of DDT. DDT is the principal chemical in the fight against malaria. However, malaria kills 800,000 people a year. Malaria affects and makes ill 250 million people every year. Every year. The World Health Organization has determined that in most countries in the world, there are suitable alternatives to DDT. And almost all of those countries use them, and use them very effectively. However, in many countries in Africa, these alternate solutions do not work for many different reasons. Therefore, the convention and the WHO says that DDT is still needed for combating malaria in Africa. The conventions are not there to penalize countries. It's there to ensure that you get the maximum benefit without having to pay unnecessary costs. And it's not to ensure that one group of countries gains whilst another group of countries pay the penalty. The Rotterdam Convention lists all forms of asbestos except chrysotile asbestos. However, even though it lists those other kinds of asbestos, it still allows trade in them. It encourages and promotes trade in all forms of asbestos. It doesn't prohibit any of them. What the convention calls for is you to know what you are doing when you trade those chemicals. And if somebody is going to export them to you, they tell you. That is the essence of the Rotterdam Convention. The exporter tells the importer that I'm sending you the chemical, and the importer says, thank you very much, please go ahead. That is how the Rotterdam Convention works. It is pleasing to hear that Kyrgyzstan has banned most of the chemicals, or if not all of the chemicals, that are listed in Annex 3 of the Rotterdam Convention. That is an exceptional performance by Kyrgyzstan. However, the convention doesn't ask you to do that. Right? All it asks you to do is, if you're going to export them to someone, tell them. If somebody is going to export them to you, they must tell you. That is what the convention calls for. Right? And our job is to ensure that all parties are aware of this and use it however they wish. If parties wish to enact bans on chemicals, that is their right. Now that my first slide is up, I ask you to move to the next one. The objective of the convention is to promote shared responsibility. It's this cooperation amongst the parties that is being asked for. Indeed, if there were a listing of chrysotile asbestos under the Rotterdam Convention today, you should see no change in the trade that you currently do for import or export. The convention doesn't affect local use anyway, so it could not affect what you manufacture for use in your own country, what you mine for use in your own country. It has no bearing on national production, national manufacture, and national trade. It only involves exports and imports. We have offered to many countries as a secretariat, if a party wishes it, to assist them with making arrangements for export and import notifications with their trading partners, so that if a chemical is listed, they would see no change, no difference to what they do with their national industry. Because the convention doesn't ask for it. You, the parties, did not make that a part of the convention. Next slide. A chemical does not come into the Rotterdam Convention because some magic group or the Secretariat says this is a bad thing. The only way in which a chemical can be considered by the Convention's technical body, the Chemical Review Committee, is if a country takes action themselves. If Kyrgyzstan takes action to say we are worried about a particular chemical and we want to make sure that we control how it comes into our borders, they will inform the Secretariat that they have taken action themselves at a national level. And they want all other countries to respect what they do. So if you want to send something to them, make sure that you follow their rules. The Secretariat then informs every country in the world that if you want to send that chemical to Kyrgyzstan, you have to respect their national rules. Right? That is how a chemical comes to the attention of the Rotterdam Convention. Countries have already taken national action, national legislation to control a chemical. And in most cases, it's not to ban it. Most of the time, what they want is to get the safety data sheets, or they want to know what quantity is coming in, they want to know who's importing it. It's very rare for the countries to actually ban the chemical. It also extends to severely hazardous pesticide formulations. Next slide. The key way in which the convention functions centers around the prior informed consent procedure, or commonly called the PIC procedure. And this helps countries who are making imports to decide how much they want and whether they've had enough. And if you want to use a chemical in the fields to assist with crop production, you want to make sure that the information is there for the farmers on how to use the chemical, and almost always the entity that knows most about a chemical is the one who makes it. So usually you ask them to send you information on how best to handle the chemical. It also ensures that governments are aware of what governments are doing. In many developing countries, one of the concerns they had when they were negotiating the convention was that developed countries would ship things to them that they have no idea the shipments are taking place. So lots of things are moving in and out of their borders, and they have no idea what's going on. Now, I understand that many of them had ulterior reasons, because if you don't know what's coming in, you can't charge the right taxes at the borders. But the argument was for safety reasons, and make sure that if the country needs 1,000 tons, they don't send us 10,000 tons, and the other 9,000 tons ends up sitting in a warehouse somewhere because nobody can use it. So information exchange is what is the core behind how the convention functions. You share the information from the ones who have it to the ones who need it. Ironically, in many cases, what this did was it allowed for increases in trade. The exports were dramatically increased in some chemicals, and it went down considerably in others. Because you're not allowed under the convention to introduce those restrictions for simple trade gains. In other words, if there is a health concern, yes. If you simply want to protect trade against other countries, then it's not allowed under the Rotterdam Convention. So the Chemical Review Committee reviews all of these exchanges to ensure that they meet the requirements. And finally, there's the Secretariat, me and my group, who are simply there to do whatever you tell us to do. Right? There is no rhyme, reason, or limit. It's whatever you, the parties, determine you want your Secretariat to do, is what the Secretariat does. And the principal task we've been assigned is to make sure that as many parties as possible understand fully the benefits that they can achieve under the Rotterdam Convention, and that they receive those benefits. Next slide, please. I now want to go through a quick summary of the PIC procedure, the prior informed consent procedure. And at the end of this series of additions to this slide, you will see that all of this can be totally bypassed by any country taking any action it wishes. Now, firstly, hang on a minute, the party submits a final regulatory action. In other words, a country has to do something in its own borders to say, we wish to take action against a particular chemical. That's still not enough for the prior informed consent procedure to go into force. A second similar action against that chemical is required, and is required by a country that's in a different region. So Kazakhstan taking action and Kyrgyzstan taking action is not sufficient to bring that chemical to the attention of the Chemical Review Committee. You would require a country in Africa or a country in Latin America or Europe to also take that same action before that chemical will come up for consideration by the Chemical Review Committee for listing under the convention. If you've received this second notification, the Chemical Review Committee will then evaluate the chemical and then make a recommendation for its listing in Annex 3. The Conference of the Parties will then review this recommendation. The Chemical Review Committee is a scientific and technical body. It evaluates it based on purely scientific reasoning. When they make that recommendation to the Conference of the Parties is a political body. It will look at the recommendation from its technical group and then determine whether or not its parties can take on those obligations. In the case of all asbestos products, they agreed. In the case of crystal asbestos, there were other factors which they thought they could not take on those responsibilities. Right? So it's a political decision at that level. Once the COP takes a decision, countries are given a decision guidance document which basically says this is how you do it. And this is sent to all the designated national authorities in the countries. The Secretariat gathers all of this information, reviews it, assists countries in meeting their obligations. Please move to the next slide. And informs all countries through the prior informed consent circular. This is a magazine that we send out every quarter to all countries to inform them of what changes have taken place. Next slide, please. And the next one, and the next one, and the next one. Now, I want to draw your attention to the big arrow on the right-hand side, the brown one. All of this formal listing procedure that takes place that I've described applies if one wants to make a chemical globally listed under the Rotterdam Convention. In other words, it sits in Annex 3. But most chemicals do not go through that procedure because most chemicals, their impact is national. If a country wants to have the PIC procedure applied to any chemical, they only need to take national action against it and inform the Secretariat. And as you can see with the brown arrow, all of the rest of the process is bypassed and you go straight to implementing the Rotterdam Convention. So it doesn't require that a chemical be listed in Annex 3 for the PIC procedure to be enforced. If the Bahamas wishes to have the Rotterdam Convention apply to crystal asbestos, all they have to do is pass a national law or implement national policy with a ministerial declaration, inform the Secretariat of the Rotterdam Convention, and for any country who wishes to send crystal asbestos to the Bahamas, they would have to follow the PIC procedure under the Rotterdam Convention. Many countries have already done this. I think the number is around 60 or 70, right? Which is almost half the parties. So even if the chemical is not listed under Article 3 or Annex 3, likelihood is that it will still have to go through the PIC procedure for almost all countries. Right? So the easier way, and the way in which most countries go, is to have national action and inform the Secretariat, and then the PIC procedure applies for their country. Next slide. There is lots of collaboration because chemicals management is not done in isolation. With the Basel Convention on transboundary movement of hazardous waste, with the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants, where they actually do ban chemicals. There's integrated technical assistance, so if a country wants assistance in meeting these obligations or understanding them or explaining them, the secretariats are there to do that. And also for bringing financial and other assistance to the country in the form of development assistance through interactions with national governments on a bilateral basis. The benefits that accrue, next slide, that it helps with trade because it supports importing countries to make informed decisions. It improves the relations between trading countries, and it gives a good legal basis to carry out the trade. There, next slide. The prior informed consent circular gives details on regulatory actions taken by other countries. It gives information on health impacts, and it circulates these guidance documents on how best to utilize the convention and the chemicals. Next slide. There is a global network of these designated national authorities that all countries have access to, and it gives them the opportunity to exchange information for countries who have similar circumstances. Next slide, please. The technical assistance, and the parties cooperate in developing infrastructure and capacity, so you can get assistance in putting in place your ability to use the prior informed consent procedure. You have access to donor funding. Once a chemical is listed under the Rotterdam Convention, then many countries make available ODA assistance, or overseas development assistance, to facilitate countries implementing those obligations on those chemicals. And you can strengthen the capacity of parties to assess the risks. You get more information, so you can make judgments on how best to utilize those chemicals in your country, and you get to develop a national chemicals profile. Next slide, please. I want to emphasize that nowhere in the presentation of the mandates of the Rotterdam Convention did it stipulate that trade is to be reduced, changed, increased, any of those things. It simply says trading partners should be informed partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Donald Cooper.